Welcome to the Cloakroom with Peter Roskam. Former Congressman Peter Roskam leads Baker Hostetler's federal policy team. Through interviews with leading members of Congress, Peter provides an insightful first-hand view into the latest policy and political debates on Capitol Hill. In today's episode of the Cloakroom with Peter Roskam, Peter interviews Congressman David Schweikert, a Republican from Arizona. Congressman Schweikert serves on the Tax Writing Ways and Means Committee. As lawmakers weigh what to do in 2025 when key provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expire, amounting to a $4.5 trillion tax increase, Congressman Schweikert will be in the middle of that debate. Let's listen in to the Cloakroom with Peter Roskam.
Well, Congressman David Schweikert, it's great to be in conversation with you today for a number of reasons. Number one, I think you're an incredibly interesting person and know you personally, and we're going to talk about what I think is interesting about you. But number two, you're also in the middle of an incredibly interesting political environment. That is the middle of Arizona, a swing state that both the presidential campaigns are all over right now, and you're on the verge of being involved in a massive policy debate on Capitol Hill next year, dealing with the 2025 tax Armageddon. So first of all, thank you, David, for taking the time to visit with us on the Cloakroom with Peter Roskam.
Peter, thank you for having me. We should disclose that you and I have known each other. We've disliked each other, and then we became very good friends. And that you mentored me when I ended up on the Ways and Means Committee and kept me from doing stupid things. So,
wow,
it's appreciated.
Listen, we've had a good relationship, and I think that that's testament to a lot of things that sometimes people don't understand about politics, how incredibly relational it is, and the ability to learn from one another and interact with one another. So tell us, David, what's going on in Arizona right now? The whole world's watching. You're right in the middle of it in a competitive district, in a competitive state. What's it like on the ground?
Okay, first off, a bit of understanding of Arizona. Arizona, in many ways, is a ginormous suburb. Remember, we may be the most urbanized state in America because there's so little private land here. So 64% of the population of Arizona lives in one county. My county is 7 congressional districts. So in some ways, I'm blessed to be a bit of a rarity. I have an urban-suburban district. I actually go into almost downtown Phoenix. But I have the blessing of having a very well-educated district, a somewhat aspirational, if not prosperous district. And as the politics of the last few years have gone, the Republican Party has become more rural. The Republican Party has become more working class. And you have someone like myself where I'm sort of sandwiched in between.
So how does that translate in terms of you're taking a conservative worldview, and that's how you're voting, and that's how you're advocating on Capitol Hill? Is that a matter of translating these things back to a constituency and teaching, or how do you handle that pressure?
That's actually a brilliant way to phrase it. When you have a well-educated district, we learn don't talk down to them. So we do a newsletter every Monday, and it has like 80,000 subscribers. And we don't dumb it down. We give you, analysis of the BLS statistics, Bureau of Labor Statistics. We do charts. And it's been interesting. I think we're able to do things that almost no other congressional district really can do. And I will get people who will come up and almost say, look, I'm not thrilled with Republicans, but at least I believe you're treating us honestly like adults. And that seems to be our formula.
So part of that adult conversation I've had with you, and it relates to your concerns about the debt. And I think it's really be helpful to unpack that. And Let me just give you a running start.
Remember, you started this. You
Yeah,
started
I know.
this.
I did. So lay it out. Where are we? What do we need to be thinking about?
First, you got to understand the political class, and both on the right and the left, are terrified of the subject. You make friends, you get donors, you get votes by giving things away. And when you explain we borrow about $80,000 a second, every day, every second, and it's going to get dramatically worse, particularly over the next decade. At the end, in a decade, we have about 23% of America that is 65 and up. The thing that I find in my presentations that I get the most boos at is when you show 100% of borrowing for the next 30 years is demographics. It's almost all healthcare costs, mostly Medicare. And in a decade when the Social Security Trust Fund is empty, do you backfill it with general fund revenues or some other mechanism? And so can you have an intellectually honest conversation saying, do you keep having debates about financing of healthcare? Obamacare, the ACA, was a financing bill. Medicare for All is a financing approach. The Republican alternative was a financing bill. How about if we would even have the intellectually honest conversation of adopting technology, procedures, other things to crash the actual price of healthcare, not how we finance it? And this is hard, but diabetes is 33% of all U.S. healthcare spending. Take on diabetes. Obesity, we calculate over the next 10 years will add an additional $9 to $9.1 trillion of healthcare spending. We could actually slow down the growth curve of U.S. debt and have a healthier, more prosperous society, and maybe stop the cycle where prime-age males are dying younger.
So let me press in on that a little bit. So what you're describing, there's so often times in politics where various budget efforts and continuing resolutions and cutting, 3% of this agency and 4% of that agency and top lines and bottom lines, and it all becomes a big garbled mess. What I hear you saying, though, is that those numbers that I've just described are incredibly insignificant compared to just the demography and the pressure in terms of healthcare spending. Have I characterized that properly?
You need to be much more brutal. It's an intellectual fraud. The left, if you actually look at the actual tax proposals of we're going to raise the taxes on corporations and everyone making over $400,000, and you do the economic effects, you get about 1.5% of GDP. Those of us who believe we need to cut spending, if you add up everything in non-defense discretionary and you just brutalize it, you could get 1% of GDP. So total 2.5% of GDP. We're borrowing 7% of the entire economy just this year. What that basically means is what you're going to hear from the political class this election cycle in many ways is a mathematical fraud. And we're terrified to tell the truth. There's ways to make this work, but you're going to do it through policy, not through raising taxes and not through the cuts. You may have to do both of those. But the real momentum of changing economic growth, changing the cost of government, having more family formation, more longevity, crushing the cost of healthcare, actually comes through disruptive policy. And you've been there. You've been on Capitol Hill with me. There's an army of lobbyists, both from the agencies and the private sector, who do not like having their business models disrupted. And that's the thing we have to toughen up and say, we're going to do what's right for the economy, for health, for the future, instead of sort of pandering to the incumbent business and bureaucracy class.
The image that comes to mind, David, when you're describing this, like the pressure that we're under, is like you're in a locked chamber and the water is rising and the air is decreasing, and what you've described as the political class says, "Oh, I found a tiny little little slit over here," but your point is you can't get it out fast enough, and you've got to change this. So, give me a sense of if you're a 21-year-old coming into politics and you listen to this podcast and you say, I find it really interesting to think about disruptive policies. Set the policy, the actual recommendations aside just for a second, and lay out a strategy for trying to garner support on Capitol Hill for some of the types of things, the remedies, the disruptive policies. How would you go about doing that? Using your perch, for example, as vice chairman of the Joint Economic Commission and other things. How do you do that?
I've grown to believe I cannot convince the elected class to learn and think differently. There's actually some academics who've done analysis saying, look, when you end up in a position, whether it be a corporate CEO or a member of Congress, often what you know, what you process is what you understood, what you had been educated on, what you knew the day you walked into the job. And as you know, they keep us so busy. There's almost no time to actually read, to study, to actually talk to folks who aren't there, on a paid gig to lobby you. So we've actually tried to reshape our office to operate more like a think tank. Hey, is there a medical disruption? Is there a energy disruption? Is there, like we were just having a conference minutes ago about a new technology that dramatically improves the productivity of photovoltaic cells. Now, the problem is those are being developed on the other side of the world because the idiocy of how we do policy is the federal government, particularly this administration, we hand out cash to last generation or the generation before that manufacturing instead of putting that cash into the disruption of what would make it better, faster, cheaper. So to your question, I think the way you change policy and have the revolution of an optimistic future is it has to come from the voters. The community, that 21-year-old needs to pick up the phone and go and say, I want to become a congressional staffer, not because I'm going to regurgitate the talking points that are 10 years out of date, but I'm going to drag my member of Congress, my senior staff, my committee staff to understand there's new technology that could crash the price of healthcare. But you got to take on a lot of vested interest. That you and I used to talk about this. The thing you can blow into that instantly tells you have a particular virus that can bang off your medical records on your phone and order your antivirals, just the algorithm does it, is illegal in America because there's no human involved in that technology. But it could crash the price of healthcare and make your life much more convenient. Are you willing to take on the bureaucracy that doesn't want the automation of their job?
So we're on the verge of a massive tax event in this country, and really a tax Armageddon of 2025 with expiring provisions of both the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, a very uncertain political future in terms of who's going to be in the majority, who's going to be in the White House, et cetera. You are one of 5 members of Congress who were present during the debate and helped shape the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and were incredibly influential on the Republican side. How are you approaching this next go around in light of the debt pressure that you've talked about, and in light of sort of a shifting populist notion in the United States on both sides of the aisle? Just kind of, it seems like some bumper sticker solutions are getting more more attractive to people that are, it's just frankly less robust and less thoughtful. How are you approaching the 2025 tax debate?
And Peter, because you were in the room, most folks don't understand. You were, one of the senior folks who spent years working through the math on how you maximize economic growth and minimize sort of the disruption to tax receipts. Most folks don't understand the 2017 tax reform. There were a few $1 trillion of tax hikes and several trillions of tax cuts because it was a modernization of the tax code. It wasn't a bunch of tax cuts. It was a modernization to bring it back into what an economy looked like today instead of 30 years ago. Well, guess what's happened? Since 2017, the economy has gone through another revolution and we need to prepare. AI, synthetic biology, and those things are going to change what our economy looks like over the next decade. And yet our tax system often incentivizes the previous generation of economic vitality. So part of my mission is with my joint economic economists, I'm number 4 now on Ways and Means, is how do I convince the people around us, think about it like an economist. If we have $400 billion a year in automatic tax increases that begin at the end of the next year, and you say, I don't want those taxes to go up because they're going to affect individuals and small businesses and pass-throughs and employee-owned and estate. Help me find a way to minimize the cost of those, but design a tax code that maximizes investments in productivity, because that's how you raise wages. That was one of the things you used to advocate, is expensing and research development, because they have a cost today, but they're timing effects, and they raise wages, particularly over the year after that and year after that. So how do you approach the tax-ageddon, as you call it, intellectually and say, this isn't binary. Raise these people's taxes, cut these people. Instead, can you do policy that's both tax-based and approach on how we do things in healthcare, how we do things in energy, how we do things in the size of government, and put it all together as a package? And I sometimes feel very lonely. I do these whole presentations on sort of the unified theory of, okay, whether you like it or not, I can do this over here on taxes, but you're going to have to do something on talent-based immigration, because we just created an investment incentive to invest in lots of new startups and new ways to do things, but we'll need the talent base coming in the United States to help do that. And you get these blank looks of saying, you're going to have to legalize certain technologies. You're going to have to do things on immigration. You're going to have to do things in the tax code. You're going to have to do things in the regulatory code. And that's just not how the modern Congress works, because it doesn't fit in a 20-second soundbite.
It's really interesting just listening to you going through these things, because, on the one hand, something that you said really struck me a minute ago, and that is the nature of disruptive policies and so forth, and how and I'm putting words into your mouth, but the tax code is tending to fight the last war. In military doctrine all the time, that's what war planners are always concerned about. Like, we need to anticipate the nature of the next war. And so your discussion of AI and these other things they really do flip the game board in terms of thinking about it. And my sense is that there's not a lot of people that are doing that. But you're also running up against this tension, David, that's inherent in the system. And that is, it's a system that is largely designed for incremental change, because we are a big, complicated group of people in the United States. And the founders had a really low view of human nature, as you know, and they put in these institutional restraints, which is our 3 co-equal branches. And basically they put in all these exit ramps. And so I think that part of the name of the game has to be developing more people with a high tolerance for creativity like you have to be able to come in and say, listen, we're going to have to be a little more aggressive than we're used to, because the type of change that you're describing is, I've always said comprehensive is the most toxic word in American politics.
Oh, it is.
Comprehensive anything is
But
like, ooh, back off. Nobody trusts the government that much. And
okay,
so I think,
Pete,
I, but I really think you're onto something in terms of the framing of the 2025 tax debate as an opportunity to think about what the tax code should look like for the next round. And when you talked about AI, it really triggered something in my mind. It's like, I
Peter,
hadn't really thought that way.
Peter, I need you to even become more aggressive. It's not only the barriers of incrementalism; it's the protection of incumbency, and it's not elected incumbency; it's incumbent bureaucracies, incumbent business models. How many times did you have someone in your office lobbying you? And when they walked out, you said, "Oh, they were lobbying me to make sure that we keep the rules, the regs, and the taxes in a certain way to block competition."
Hmm.
It is shocking how much of what you and I dealt with and I deal with today is rent seeking. If you remember your high school economics class, it's we're here to make sure that the tax and regulatory codes, rules on trade, rules on tariffs, everything benefits our bureaucracy, our business model, and keeps new entries that might do it faster, better, cheaper. So you have a societal problem though. We're going to borrow a couple $1 trillion this year. In 10 years, that will have doubled. In 15 years, the United States has more deaths than births. Fertility rates are down. We had fewer children last year than many countries in Western Europe. We have to deal with the reality that business models, bureaucratic models, the way we do government is going to have to be comfortable with using technology for labor substitution, other things. But you could have a much wealthier, much more prosperous country if you could not only think just about the tax code. Inflation Reduction Act, which is an Orwellian name, is going to spend $1 trillion, $2 trillion in functionally grants and handouts and those things. And the way it's designed, it's industrial policy handing money to last generation or two generation old technology, instead of taking a fraction of that and dragging us to be the most competitive in the world because we are the home of the next generation of cutting edge. And you make a lot of friends when you hand them a check that's coming from the taxpayers on borrowed money. But Peter, you'll know this. Every dime a member of Congress votes on is now borrowed.
Yeah.
Every dime of defense is now borrowed money. Every dime of non-defense discretionary is borrowed money. And this year, my estimation is $300 to $400 billion of mandatory spending. So of earned benefits like Medicare will be also in borrowed money. You don't have time for incrementalism.
Right. David, before we let you go, give us a little horse race on presidential politics and presidential elections in Arizona mid-September. What's it looking like down there?
What's been fascinating is like my district. I'm either number one or number two highest inflation in America. So unless you make about 26, 27% more today in the Phoenix Scottsdale community than the day President Biden took office, you're poor. And what's been fascinating is watching particularly, the Democrat nominee and sometimes even our Republican nominee not talking to the stresses that even upper middle class families are going through at the end of the month, trying to figure out how do they pay for things. I don't think there's enough empathy happening out there on how tough maintaining people's sort of normality of their lives is. And I'm finding that particularly the Republican nominee is doing better than many of us expected in Arizona because of the economics of
Fascinating.
it's, at some point you may not like certain uses of language or these things, but you want your family to survive. You want to be able to have a vacation. You want to be able to have retirement. You want to be able to help your kids go to, school. And that's now front of mind.
Well, Congressman David Schweikert, you have a great gift of creativity and vision, and I've seen it on display, and I'm glad you are where you are. And I really, really appreciate your taking the time to have a conversation with us. And for those of you who are listening, I'm Congressman Peter Roskam, former Congressman Peter Roskam. This is the Cloakroom with Peter Roskam. I hope you spread the word, listen, and subscribe. And David, thanks again. Have a good day.
I appreciate you having me.
Thank you, Peter and Congressman Schweikert. If you have any questions for Peter, his full contact information is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening to Baker Hosts and the Cloakroom with Peter Roskam. Comments heard on Baker Hosts are for informational purposes and should not be construed as legal advice regarding any specific facts or circumstances. Listeners should not act upon the information provided on Baker Hosts without first consulting with a lawyer directly. The opinions expressed on Baker Hosts are those of participants appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the firm. For more information about our practices and experience, please visit bakerlaw.com.